Tonight we're going to start with something truly cruel. In your job description, you might die before lunch. If you want to eat, bring your own weapon. We will delve into why being a soldier in the Middle Ages was the worst career choice in human history. Forget about the romantic knights and shiny armors that Hollywood has sold you. The reality is that you may not survive the first battle. If you do this, in the short rest of your life, you will regret not having done so. So before you feel comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Please tell me in the comments where and when you watch it. It's always fascinating to see people from all over the world join us. Now, dim the lights or turn on the fan to emit a soft background hum. Let's start tonight's journey together with ease. Congratulations! You have just joined the medieval army. Pay attention to the quotation marks around recruitment, because in the 12th century, military service was not a career choice. This is a manifestation of conscription, coercion, or despair. You didn't apply for this position. Someone knocked on your door with a sword, politely telling you that you now belong to the God who knows only, until further notice. For if you are too poor, too hungry, and have no future at all, joining the army is the only option instead of starving to death in a ditch. Anyway, welcome to hell. Your new workplace has no human resources department, no safety regulations, and absolutely no retirement plan except for the glorious sacrifice for your Lord. The good news is that both accommodation and meals are provided. The bad news is that this room is a tent shared by you and 12 other people who haven't taken a bath. The wooden board is made of moldy bread and anything you can find on the enemy's corpse. Your daily uniform includes everything you had when you joined, plus a helmet that might not fit and weapons older than your grandfather. If you are very lucky, you might get a cotton-padded jacket called Gambia Sun. It is basically a quilt with sleeves, and its protective effect on the sword is just like that of a woolen sweater on a bear. However, this is still better than nothing. Most soldiers are like this. Chainmail, that's a matter for the rich. Board armor, you'd better find a unicorn. Most medieval soldiers dressed like very pessimistic farmers when they went to battle because that was how they were. Those farmers who were handed sharp weapons were asked to kill the others who were also handed sharp weapons. When it comes to those sharp things, your weapon might be a spear hook, or if you're really lucky, a sword you've seen for decades, is not precisely forged wools. These are all farm tools, which have been shaped into blurry military forms by local blacksmiths. The blacksmith learned the trade from his uncle, who had once seen a real weapon from a distance. The tip of your spear is swaying, your sword blade is as sharp as a butter knife, and that long hook still smells like the hay it had cut before. But this is your life now. At dawn, standing in the field, holding a suspicious weapon in hand, wearing clothes that smelled like wet sheep, surrounded by other pitiful people who had also suffered misfortune in medieval life. The enemy's army is somewhere outside, perhaps poorly equipped and surely very scared. Very soon, you will see them in the most unpleasant way. Let's start with recruitment. This word makes the entire process sound voluntary and professional. It isn't. The armies of the Middle Ages were assembled through a pleasant combination of feudal obligations, extreme poverty, and what we now call kidnapping. If you are a farmer, you should serve in the military for your master. Period. Non-mine is transferable. As soon as he called, you came. You might be in the harvest season. Your wife might be going to have a baby. Your house might be on fire. No problem. Lord Edmund needs manpower to settle his recent territorial dispute, so you put everything aside to report for duty. Your family will find out, or they won't. This is not the problem of the military. Then comes the impression. It is equivalent to Shanghai in the Middle Ages. Recruiters would sweep through towns and villages, grabbing strong men working in the field from the streets. Congratulations! You are now an infantryman walking to the market. Welcome to the siege train and have a drink in the tavern. Your ale has become more expensive because you have to pay with your life. Some people try to hide. They would flee to the forest, disguise themselves as merchants, or claim that they had suddenly contracted a mysterious disease. Smart approaches, but seldom work. The authorities of the Middle Ages had seen every trick in the book, and they had creative ways to deal with those who evaded military service. For those who cannot be conscripted into the army, they are always in despair. Medieval Europe was a harsh place for ordinary people. Crop failures, plagues, famines and economic collapses forced people to look for any job that could provide food and shelter. The army provided them with a reasonable chance to die a tragic death. But beggars cannot be picky. These voluntarily recruited soldiers are often the most dangerous ones because they have nothing. They have lost their farm, their family and their future. War is just another form of poverty, but at least it comes with weapons. Then there are the criminals. The judicial system in the Middle Ages had a fascinating practice of allowing convicted felons to make a choice. Either be put to death and join the army. Most people choose to join the army because it is better to die on the battlefield than to die on the gallows. These people have brought a unique set of skills to their military experience. They know how to fight in a filthy environment, how to survive in a harsh one, and how to seek opportunities in chaos. They also know how to give up at the first sign of real trouble. Your comrades minus arms are not from the neighborhood watch team. They are reluctant farmers, desperate beggars and real criminals. Have a good sleep. Once you get in, there's no way back. Deserters would be sentenced to death, and many evil commanders attached great importance to this rule. Whether you like it or not, you have already signed the contract. The duration can range from a few weeks to several years, depending on how long your lord's ambition has persisted and the number of enemies he has made. This is your life now. There are no holidays, no sick leaves, no workers' compensation, only daily training, bad food, and constant knowledge. Tomorrow you might be asked to rush into a sharp steel wall, which is being swarmed by people who are as scared and angry as you. Welcome to the military experience of the Middle Ages. Things will only get worse. The training of the medieval army was cruel, short and just barely sufficient. Forget about those Hollywood montage-style knights practicing elegant swordsmanship in the castle courtyard. Medieval military training was more like, here is a sharp stick. Try not to poke yourself. You may have a few weeks to figure out how to hold your weapon without cutting off your own fingers. Then you should use it against those who want to kill you. If you are an infantryman, your training includes learning 3 basic skills: how to stand in a line, how to move in a line, how to die in a line. Formation warfare was the pillar of medieval warfare, and your survival depended on the people around you. If you disrupt your formation, you will be killed by the enemy's cavalry, and you won't have time to say fight on your own. Your instructors are all seasoned soldiers who have learned this craft just to avoid dying. They have no patience for problems, no patience for complaints, and absolutely no patience for those who can't keep up. If you learn slowly, you will get extra attention from the baton. If you are too slow, you will be assigned to the front, where natural selection will solve the problem quickly. The training plan is very simple. Get up before dawn. Train with weapons until your arms are sore. Move forward with your full set of equipment until your feet bleed. Then collapse onto the bed and do it again tomorrow. Only the deceased can rest in peace. You weren't dead at that time. Although your training is to prepare you for the unexpected, weapon training is particularly harsh. Swords are expensive and rare, so most soldiers train with wooden substitutes, which will break upon impact, leaving painful scars. The work of a spear involves learning how to stab, how to defend, and how to fall backward when your spear shaft breaks under pressure. Archery training, if you are lucky enough to be assigned as an archer, means shooting at the target until your fingers hurt and bleed, and then shooting again. Our goal is not to make you an expert. The goal of the game is to ensure that players do not die immediately when facing real battles. This is a very low standard, and many soldiers still haven't passed. Physical training is a special kind of hell. Wars in the Middle Ages required tremendous physical endurance. You need to march 20 meters every day with 60 pounds of equipment and still have enough strength to fight at the end of the battle. The purpose of training the march is to break the weak and eliminate those who can't keep up with the rhythm. The soldiers fell down due to exhaustion, dehydration and extreme pain. Some people can never stand up again. Those who participated in the military service learned that military service in the Middle Ages was not so much about honor as it was more about tempering one's willpower. You weren't trained to be a hero. You were trained to be a survivor. Surviving in the wars of the Middle Ages meant learning to endure more punishment than you could ever imagine. Discipline is maintained through cruel punishment and peer pressure. If you cross the line, you will face flogging, reduced rations, or be assigned to the most dangerous tasks. If you mess it up, you'll be executed as an example for others. But usually the most severe punishment is the contempt of your comrades. In a world where your survival depends on the people around you, being labeled as a coward or a weakling is equivalent to being sentenced to death. So you endured the training, no matter how painful it was, no matter how desperate it seemed, because the other option was worse. Moreover, the real pain has not yet begun. When you finally encounter the enemy in battle, all the insufficient training will be put to the final test. Medieval military equipment is a master-level course. You get what you give and you will be grateful for it. If you are expecting shiny armor and perfectly balanced weapons, you will be very disappointed. When most soldiers go to battle, their lords give them as much as they can, usually not much. The lucky person got a helmet. It might not be appropriate. Since the last person died inside, it surely hasn't been washed, and at critical moments, it has an unsettling tendency to slide into your eyes. But it's made of metal. Metal is better than nothing. Everyone else has it. Your main weapon is likely to be a spear, as it has a low manufacturing cost and requires minimal training to be used effectively. Point the tip at the enemy. Try to poke them before they poke you. It's simple in theory, but terrifying in reality. These are not ritual weapons made by master blacksmiths. They were rough grey rods with any scrap iron that a local blacksmith could hammer on them. And they were a bit pointed in shape. The machine head shook, the shaft broke under pressure, and the binding strap loosened at the worst moment. But when you stand in a shield wall facing the charging cavalry, even a bad spear can overcome cruel words. Swords are rare and expensive, and only the rich or experienced can use them. If you can buy one, it's very likely passed down by someone who died inside. The battlefield swords of the Middle Ages were not as elegant as those of the later centuries. They are blunt and heavy-cutting tools, specifically designed to pierce through armor and bones. They become dull quickly, fall off easily and require frequent maintenance, which you may not be able to afford. The cross may become loose, the grip may be worn smooth, and the saddle head may fall off when it is inconvenient. But hey, this is still better than a sharp stick. Hardly any. Armor is a luxury that most soldiers dream of. The cost of chainmail exceeded the annual income of a peasant family. The board armor is too expensive. It looks as if it were made of unicorn horns. What you get is a wild deer and a cotton-padded jacket filled with any available fabric fragments. It looks like a quilt and feels as if wearing a mattress, offering as much protection as wishful thinking. But this is still better than nothing, and most armies do not provide it. The Gambi send people will stop slashes and light arrows. A direct hit from a sword, axe or crossbow arrow will go directly through it. But at least when you die, you know that you have taken some protective measures. Your level 2 equipment is anything you can scratch, steal, or improvise. A knife used for eating and close combat, usually the same knife, and if one is lucky, there will also be a bowl and a spoon. If you don't really think about what the stain is, a blanket might keep you warm. A leaking water bottle taste, like the leather used to make it. If you still have personal belongings after the recruitment is over, you can bring some. That's it. That's all your property. Everything you need to survive in the medieval wars is on your back, and every step you take is overwhelming. Although it's not much, it's yours. At least until someone kills you and takes it away. The worst thing is not the poor quality of the equipment. The fact is that you are responsible for maintaining it yourself. There is no armory sergeant, no supply station, and no replacement parts. If your spear breaks, you should repair it or find a new one. If your armor is torn, you either fix it or don't. If your weapon becomes blunt, sharpen it on any stone you can find. In this process, the disadvantages may outweigh the advantages. You are required to be a soldier, blacksmith, tailor and military supply officer at the same time. If you fail to play any of these roles well, you're doomed. It's just that simple. The insufficient maintenance of equipment in medieval wars was extremely ruthless. As most soldiers do not know how to properly maintain their equipment, the casualty rate reflects the harsh reality. Military food in the Middle Ages was a survival adventure, not an interesting one. Imagine the worst buffet you've ever had. Then subtract half of the raw materials, add some molds, cool down and serve on the table. This is the dinner in the medieval army. If you are lucky enough to have a meal, the standard staple food is bread. When I say bread, I mean a dense, gritty substance that can also be used as a building material. It is baked with any available grains, which may include barley, oats, or in times of despair, ground acorns and sawdust. This kind of bread is too hard to bite through. It's not fresh at all. It can survive the winter. It was so unappetizing that even the mice approached it cautiously. Accompanying this cooking nightmare is soup. A thin gruel, using any leftovers that can be thrown into the pot, vegetables, if found, grains, if there are any extra grains, meat, if something that died recently is not yet started to rot. The final result is a bowl of grey, blocky soup, which tastes like disappointment and smells even worse. But it is usually hot and contains enough nutrients to sustain your life, which is indeed what medieval military cooking is cited for. Taste is a luxury that the military cannot afford. Nutrition can be negotiated. Survival is the only goal. Fresh meat is a rare treat, usually only available after a successful battle, or when the supply train manages to catch up with the army. By meat, and in any animal that unfortunately wanders along the path that soldiers must take. A lame horse, a cast limb from an abandoned farm, and sometimes even a dog and a cat, if the situation is really bad. It was baked over an open flame by those who learned to cook through trial and error, and most of it was wrong. The result is usually burnt on the outside and droll on the inside, seasoned with ashes, smoke and the bitter taste of despair. But protein is protein, and medieval soldiers couldn't be picky about its source. Water is another persistent problem. Clean drinking water is scarce. Polluted water can kill you faster than an enemy's arrow. Soldiers learned to drink beer or wine as much as possible, not because they were alcoholics, but because fermentation killed most harmful microorganisms. Malt liquor is very light and wine is very sour. They both taste like they have been filtered through dirty socks, but they are safer than the other option, which is cholera, dysentery, or any other water-borne plague. Getting drunk is a survival strategy, not a choice of lifestyle. For any soldier who wants to replenish his meager rations, foraging has become a necessary skill. You have learned to identify edible plants, catch small animals and get supplies from local residents. This polite expression covers everything from buying eggs at high prices to looting abandoned villages in search of anything edible. Moral considerations gave way to survival. You tell yourself that you will return the money to the farmers after the war, but you are well aware that you might have died long before that. The wars in the Middle Ages turned the originally upright people into scavengers and thieves, for otherwise they would starve to death. A hungry soldier is a dead soldier, and this is of no help to anyone except the enemy. The real misfortune is that malnutrition weakens your immune system when you need it the most. The malnourished soldiers contracted all the diseases that spread in the camp. Their wounds and infections healed very slowly. They lacked the strength needed for long marches and brutal battles. Food is expensive and soldiers can be sacrificed. Commanders in the Middle Ages believed that replacing dead soldiers was much cheaper than providing proper food for the living ones. Say you learned to fight on an empty stomach, march when your feet hurt, and sleep on an empty stomach. Complaining about food is a luxury and you can't afford it. There are always more battles to fight, more enemies to face, and perhaps not enough food for everyone. Medieval army meals. This is not just bad. This is strategically insufficient. Soldiers in the Middle Ages did not stay in military camps on military bases. They wandered around, leading a hard life and living in conditions so shabby that they were even more comfortable than those in prison. Home is the place where you stop the parade that day, and comfort is what you create from scratch. Your bedroom is a small plot of land. Hope it won't be too bumpy. Hope it's not too wet. Hope not occupied by other things. Your bed is a thin blanket. If you have a blanket, lay it on any mat you can piece together. If you are near a farm, you will see straw. If you are in a forest, you will see leaves. If you are on a mountain, you will see pine needles. Sometimes it's just bare land, as cold and heartless as the world in the Middle Ages. Privacy does not exist. You sleep with a dozen or so other soldiers, all of whom snore, fart, talk in their sleep, or suffer from various diseases they can't afford. The person beside you might have dysentery. There might be lice on the other side. The person opposite might have a wound infection. It smells like a dead person. It's very likely to be a dead person. Just take it slow. But you all sleep together because the body's heat is the only available heat. Freezing to death is worse than sleeping next to someone else's physical problems. A shelter is anything you can temporarily build with ready-made materials. If you're lucky, you might share a tent with a few other soldiers, which might leak. More commonly, you build a diagonal mast with branches and canvas, dig a shallow pit in the ground to shield from the wind, or simply curl up under any cover you can find and pray for the best. The rain soaked everything. The snow buried your temporary residence. The wind blew your carefully arranged protection to pieces. You can only endure it, for soldiers in the Middle Ages had no luxury of complaining about the weather. Hygiene is a long standing problem and no one wants to solve it directly. When toilets were there, they were all shallow pits dug in the wind at the camp. When they don't exist, soldiers take advantage of any privacy they can find. And that's not much. The disease spread rapidly among the troops living in such indefinite conditions at such close proximity. More medieval soldiers were ill by cholera, dysentery and typhus than by the enemy's weapons. At that time, there was no understanding of the bacterial theory, no appropriate hygiene knowledge, and of course, no medical infrastructure to deal with the consequences. You just wish you were one of those lucky ones who were until. Most soldiers were not lucky. Personal hygiene has become a wonderful memory of your ordinary life. Taking a bath is impossible. Soap should not be used. Clean clothes are a fantasy. You wear the same set of clothes for weeks or months, until they are completely worn out due to accumulated dirt and wear. Your hair is tied up. There is a layer of permanent dirt on your skin. Your smell can knock wild eagles off the garbage truck. But the smell on others was just as unpleasant. So social stigma is not the real problem. This is just another aspect of military life in the Middle Ages. You have to learn to endure because the other option is death. Even a life plagued by dirty diseases is better than having no life at all. Sleep has become a precious commodity that is always in short supply. Standing guard, night marches and pre-war preparations mean that you rarely rest for more than a few hours at a time. Really fall asleep. It's a kind of exhausted breakdown, with your body pushed to the limit, rather than the refreshing sleep of a well-rested person. You have learned to sleep in rainy, cold, noisy and uncomfortable conditions, which would keep you awake for days in ordinary life. Soldiers in the Middle Ages developed the ability to fall asleep at any place, at any time and under any conditions. This is a survival skill as important as swordsmanship and archery, because a tired soldier is a dead soldier. To survive means that no matter how unpleasant the environment is, one should learn to rest whenever there is an opportunity. The wars in the Middle Ages were nothing like movies at all. There were no elegant duels between noble knights, no dramatic speeches before battles, and no glorious charges that led to a clean and heroic death. The true medieval wars were industrial scale chaos, terror and massacre. Driven by despair, people attacked each other with crude weapons until one side could no longer continue. It was noisy, chaotic, and the stench of blood, sweat and human excrement. Because yes, people lose control of their body functions when they are frightened, which was very common in medieval wars. Your first battle is a special kind of hell, designed to separate survivors from corpses. You will stand side by side with those who are as afraid as you, waiting for the command to move forward. The enemy troops are somewhere in the distance, perhaps looking as ragged and desperate as your own army. Both armies need several hours to deploy themselves. The commander shouted orders, the bugle blew, and the flag fluttered in the wind, just like a colorful funeral shroud. The tense atmosphere will keep escalating until you can hardly breathe. Your hands are shaking so violently that you can hardly hold the weapon. Finally, someone will send out the signal of attack. Real fighting is nothing like training at all. In training, you are confronted with practice targets that do not fight back. In battle, you are up against those humans who will do everything possible to kill you before you can. When someone throws a hard punch on your head, all the skills you have painstakingly learned come to nothing. You will find yourself screaming, frantically brandishing your weapon, hoping to hit something important, while praying that nothing important hits you. The noise was deafening. People were shouting and screaming, nettles were colliding with each other, horses were screaming, and wounded soldiers were crying for help. But they might not come. You can't think and can hardly see the dust and sweat flowing into your eyes. I can only react instinctively. I hope that's enough. Medieval weapons were designed to cause the greatest damage, and they achieved admirable success. The sword cuts through armor and bones with the same efficiency. The axe split the shield and the skull. The spear pierced through the chainmail like a piece of paper. Let's transform the helmet minus wearing head into something like a broken egg. The crossbow's crossbolt completely pierced through the armored soldiers and sometimes killed those standing behind them. Facts have proved that in the face of military technology in the Middle Ages, the human body was very fragile. Something that took years to build can be destroyed in just a few seconds by a weapon designed for killing. Then there is the horse. Medieval cavalry was not merely people riding on horseback. This was a panicked beast weighing 1,000 pounds, which was directly driven into the infantry formation by equally panicked riders. War horses are trained to bite, kick and stomp on anything in their way. They would stand up on their hind legs and step on the heads and shoulders of the infantry with their iron hooves. They would push their way through the shield wall like living hammers, scattering people like bowling pins. Facing cavalry is a nightmare for every infantryman, for there is no good way to stop the determined charge of the soldiers on horseback. You can only hope that your spear is long enough, your formation is strong enough, and your courage is resolute enough, so that when and horses and riders roar towards you, you can hold your ground. The consequences of war are often worse than the fighting itself. The battlefield was filled with casualties everywhere. Many of them are people you know, trained with undate with. The air was filled with the smell of blood and death, and from time to time, the screams of the living soldiers could be heard, but they might wish they were already dead. You need to walk among the corpses, search for friends, check for enemies that may still be dangerous, and try not to step on the fragments of people scattered by the weapons of dismembered humans. This was the reality of medieval warfare. It was not a glorious battle between heroes, but a systematic destruction of humanity against humanity by humans who had every reason to kill each other. If you survived the first battle, congratulations. You have to look forward to doing it again tomorrow. Military medicine in the Middle Ages was a combination of ignorance, superstition and wishful thinking, which sometimes led to fatal consequences. If you are injured in battle, your medical care will be provided with basic first aid by anyone who happens to be nearby and is conscious enough. This might be a comrade minus in minus arms who learned battlefield medicine through trials and errors, mainly errors. It might be that a follower of a camp learned some knowledge about herbs from her grandmother. It might be a barber surgeon who trained for 3 weeks and believed that bloodletting was the cure for everything, or perhaps there was no one at all. In such a case, you would lose too much blood when thinking about the shortcomings of medieval healthcare. Battlefield surgery is performed with any tool at hand, usually knives used for cooking, combat and various other hygienic purposes. Anesthesia involves hitting your head hard to make you lose consciousness, or if you're lucky, getting you so drunk that you don't remember the whole process. Preservatives are unheard of, so infection is almost inevitable. The understanding of anatomy in the Middle Ages was mainly based on speculation and the dissection of animals, which meant that surgeons usually did not know what they were cutting or why it was important. And in any case, they will do their best, because doing something, even if it's a mistake, is always better than doing nothing. Common injuries include knife wounds, spear wounds, arrow stings, and blunt trauma, caused by maces and sticks. The treatment options are limited and most of them are ineffective, so they're cut together with any available thread, usually the same as the thread used to mend clothes and saddles. The fractured bone is fixed with wooden splints, bandaged with cloth, and then left to heal on its own. Arrow injuries are particularly problematic, because removing the arrow usually causes more damage than keeping it. Many soldiers had arrows embedded in their bodies, constantly reminding them that they had survived in some way. Infection is the real killer, although medieval doctors did not know why wounds would deteriorate or how to prevent them. They will use any reasonable method to bandage the wound: honey, wine, animal fat, ground herbs, and sometimes just clean cloth. These treatments can be helpful occasionally. More often than not, they make things worse. Gangrene is very common and is usually fatal. Blood poisoning causes death within days or weeks after the initial injury. The infection is accompanied by a depressing fever, delirium, and death. However, they have no understanding of bacteria, no concept of aseptic operation, and no effective treatment for systemic infections. Medieval soldiers who survived wars usually died slowly and painfully from complications, while modern medicine can prevent these complications with basic sanitation facilities and antibiotics. Pain management is particularly primitive. Strong alcohol is the most effective painkiller, but it is not always available. Opium does exist, but it is rare and expensive. Most wounded soldiers can only endure any pain caused by their injuries, no matter how long it takes them to recover or die. The wars in the Middle Ages produced many disabled veterans who lost their limbs, eyes, or cognitive functions due to head injuries. These people were released and sought their own livelihood in a world without social security and with little sympathy for disabled veterans. Many people became beggars, vividly reminding us of the true cost of military service in the Middle Ages. Medieval doctors completely ignored the psychological loss. They did not understand what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers who survived many battles usually showed the symptoms we see today: nightmares, flashbacks, inability to concentrate, violent outbursts, depression, and substance abuse. But all these are regarded as personality flaws rather than diseases. Veterans suffering from shell shock are regarded as cowards or weaklings, no matter how they deal with their trauma. Many people have never recovered from the psychological trauma of medieval wars. They survived the battle but lost it due to mental disorders. The medieval society offered them no help, no understanding, and no hope of recovery. Being a soldier in the Middle Ages meant accepting the fact that even if the enemy didn't kill you, medicine might. If both of these methods fail, psychological consequences are likely to occur. Military operations in the Middle Ages were not quick and decisive. They dragged on for months or years, wearing down their troops through wear and tear, illness, and the simple exhaustion of maintaining armed forces in hostile territories without sufficient supplies or support. As a soldier in the Middle Ages, you have never participated in a battle. You signed up for an endurance test that would push you beyond the limits you think you have, and keep pushing until something breaks. And it is usually you who break down. The lucky ones died soon in the battle. Unfortunate people live long enough to experience everything brought about by the medieval wars. A siege is a special kind of pain. When the army encounters a fortified city or castle, the result is often a protracted siege that may last for months or even years. The attacker will surround the defender, cut off supplies, and wait for hunger or disease to complete tasks that cannot be accomplished by direct attacks. As a besieged soldier, you will find yourself living in a semi-permanent camp outside the enemy's city walls, exposed to the constant harassment of weather, illness, and defenders. You need to spend time building siege engines, digging tunnels, or defending your position under the fire of enemy archers and trebuchets. The night brings no relief, for you need to be on guard against the desperate defenders who try to break through and destroy your fortifications. Boredom is almost as dangerous as fighting. Months of inactivity, with only brief and terrifying violent incidents interrupted, forced people to drink, gamble, fight each other, and engage in various other activities. The commander tried to stop it but was unable. Discipline collapsed during the long siege. If the soldiers have a way, they will flee. Those who remained often turned to rob the surrounding villages to obtain supplies and entertainment, alienate the local residents, and create new enemies for their army. A siege is a slow-motion disaster that drains the army from within. Even if the survivors have never faced the enemy in direct combat, they will still be traumatized untreated brutally. Disease always accompanied the armies of the Middle Ages, killing more soldiers than all the weapons combined. Will you gather thousands of people who have never taken a bath in an unhygienic environment and provide them with insufficient rations and contaminated water, A plague is inevitable. Cholera, dysentery, typhus and various other diseases swept through the military camps like wildfires. The corpses left behind had to be buried or burned to prevent further pollution of the water supply. Medical knowledge is so primitive that doctors often worsen epidemics through their well-intentioned but ignorant interventions. The winter campaign is especially brutal. Medieval armies tried to avoid fighting in cold weather, but sometimes strategic needs or political pressure forced them to continue fighting throughout the year. Winter warfare means marching through ice and snow in clothing designed for temperate weather, sleeping in an environment that is lethal to exposure, and fighting in an environment that is as dangerous as frostbite and enemy weapons. The fingers became numb and it was impossible to hold the weapon correctly. The feet were frozen in wet boots, resulting in gangrene and amputation. Hypothermia silently killed the soldiers, stealing their strength and judgment until they lay in the snow and never got up again. The psychological pressure has never lessened. Soldiers in the Middle Ages lived in constant fear, not only of death but also of the way they died. They witnessed the fate of those who were captured by enemy cavalry, trampled on by horses, or slowly bled to death due to deep wounds. They knew that being captured might mean being tortured, enslaved or executed after the battle ended. They understand that if the tactics require it, the commander might sacrifice them without hesitation. This kind of knowledge erodes morale, courage and reason. Men break down under pressure, sometimes conspicuously, sometimes quietly, but always completely. Medieval wars were not merely about killing the corpses of soldiers. It also destroyed their thoughts and spirits. After all this, you must keep fighting, keep moving forward, and keep obeying orders. That is very likely to be your death sentence. Because if there were no war, they would be executed for deserters. Another option for marching is to be left behind and die alone. Medieval soldiers learned to endure environments that modern people could not tolerate, not because they were stronger or braver, but because they had no choice. Survival means accepting that every day could be the last, every battle could be the last, and every order could send you to death. This is a cruel and ruthless battle against hope. Most of the soldiers lost the battle before they lost their lives. The social hierarchy in the medieval army was both strict and cruel. As an ordinary soldier, you occupy the lowest position. You are not a person with rights and dignity. You are a weapon with legs, expected to be pointed at the enemy and activated upon command. Command your nobles to live in a completely different world, where there is proper food, comfortable accommodation and medical care when necessary. They ride horses while you walk. They are clad in armor, while you hold hope in your heart. They make tactical decisions in a secure command position, and you carry them out with your blood. Your immediate superior is a sergeant and a corporal. They climbed up from the army just to accumulate experience and not die too long. These veterans understood that survival meant cruelty, and they enthusiastically passed this lesson on to the new recruits. They will force you to follow the discipline with sticks, fists, and any readily available simple weapons. It's not because they like it this way, although some people do, but because they know that weak soldiers are dead soldiers, and dead soldiers are useless to everyone, including themselves. The beating will continue until morale improves or until no one can beat. Officers regarded ordinary soldiers as expendable resources because they truly were. Medieval warfare was a game of numbers, and commanders calculated losses in the same way as merchants calculated inventories. How many people have to be sacrificed to capture that mountain? How many soldiers can you lose if you capture the city wall? How many casualties are acceptable to achieve the campaign goals? In these calculations, your personal life is meaningless. You are a statistical probability, a percentage probability of success or failure, an item on the human resources ledger. If mathematics shows that you have to die for strategic advantages, well, that's the cost of doing business. From food distribution to sleep arrangements, everything has strengthened class division. Officers eat meat while soldiers eat girls. The nobles slept in tents, while ordinary troops slept in the mud. The medical care received by the injured is based on their social status, rather than the severity of their injuries. A knight who suffers a minor injury will receive professional treatment, while an infantryman who suffers a fatal injury will be left in some unseen place to die quietly. This is not being cruel for the sake of being cruel. This is simple economics. Replacing and training knights are both very expensive. Infantry is both cheap and abundant. The armies of the Middle Ages invested resources accordingly. The punishment for disobedience is prompt and severe. If you ask questions and give orders, you will be flogged in front of the entire organization. As an example, if you show timidity in battle, you might be executed by your own officer to prevent the spread of panic. If you try to escape, you will be hunted down like a mad beast, then hanged, dragged out of your body, dismembered as a warning to others. The message conveyed is very clear. Your body and soul now belong to the military, and you will serve until your death relieves your duty. In the Middle Ages, armies had no early retirement, no discharge due to disability, and no glorious way out, except through victory or the grave. Even success will bring about one's own problems. If your army wins a decisive victory, you may have the opportunity to participate in looting the enemy's city. This meant that robbery, rape and murder were all permitted. Medieval commanders encouraged these acts because soldiers who were not paid needed some form of compensation. But participating in atrocities has left psychological wounds that can never heal. Refusing to participate will leave you with the impression of being weak or disloyal, which might have been a fatal label in the medieval army. Both of these options will destroy something within you, making you less human than before the war began. Ironically, although soldiers in the Middle Ages suffered greatly, they were often the most experienced and capable warriors of that era. They have learned skills that civilians do not need in peacetime: how to kill efficiently, how to survive in harsh environments, and how to function amid exhaustion, hunger and fear. But these skills pose a threat to the society they are striving to protect. Veterans returning from long minus-term battles often find civilian life hard to cope with. They were trained in violence and trauma, rather than in peaceful coexistence with people who had never experienced war. Many veterans have turned to robbery, using their military skills to plunder travelers and merchants. Others became mercenaries, selling their services to anyone who could afford it. Some people simply drink themselves to death, unable to deal with those memories that will never fade in the skills that a peaceful society does not need. The wars of the Middle Ages created a permanent lower class, who gave everything for their lords but received nothing in return, except for the knowledge of how to kill and die effectively. When the army needs them, they are heroes. When the army doesn't need them, they are problems. Let's talk about the siege battles in the Middle Ages. This is the ultimate logic of siege battles. Months or years of organized pain, with occasional brief moments of absolute terror. If conventional warfare is hell, then siege is purgatory. This is a slow and tormenting torment, leaving the military exhausted under the psychological pressure of illness, hunger and waiting for terrifying things to happen. As a besieged soldier, you will adapt to the fact that this might be the longest, most boring and deadliest experience of your military career, because the siege killed more medieval soldiers than all the fierce battles combined. Your new home will be a siege camp, a huge temporary city built around enemy fortifications. These camps are a wonder of medieval engineering, but also a disaster of medieval hygiene. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, horses, campers and logistics personnel work rammed into a place that had never been designed to accommodate so many people. The toilet is overflowing. The rate at which garbage accumulates exceeds the rate at which it is disposed of, and diseases spread among people just as wildfires spread on dry grassland. Just that smell was enough to knock a vulture off a manure truck, with human excrement, rotten food and washed corpses and a mixture filled with the scent of death everywhere. Your daily work will include building and equipping siege fortifications, trenches, earthwork, fences and platforms for siege engines. This means having to work hard for hours under the fire of enemy archers and trebuchets. You need to dig ditches when arrows roar, build walls when stones fall, and operate the siege engine when defenders are in a commanding position. Its job is both dangerous and tiring, and seems endless. Every building you construct will become the target of enemy artillery. Every position you occupy will be counterattacked by the desperate defenders. The siege engine itself is a wonder of medieval technology and a monument to the ingenuity of humanity in serving destruction. The trebuchet throws stones, animal carcasses, and occasionally heads off the enemy's walls. 3 projectiles fired with devastating precision, capable of penetrating what was considered an impregnable fortification. The siege mallets mashed the city gate to pieces. The sailors crowded under the wooden shields, praying that the enemy's defenders would not throw the boiling oil into the murder hole above. The siege tower rolled towards the enemy's city wall like a moving wooden castle, and everywhere were archers and assault troops preparing to launch a surprise attack on the battlements. However, operating these machines is a dangerous job, as it kills the operator almost as efficiently as it kills an enemy. The catapult burst under the repeated pressure of shooting, crushing the unfortunate person standing nearby. 3 bouchette balancers were swinging wildly, crushing the crew into a paste. When the defenders poured the burning asphalt into the trough of the city gate, the battering ram turned into a death trap. The siege tower is the main target of all the enemy's weapons, turning their personnel into arrow pads or human torches. Anyway, you have learned to volunteer for the siege vehicle mission because other missions are usually worse. Destruction might be the most terrifying part of a siege battle. The engineers would dig tunnels under the enemy's city walls and then set fires to destroy the supports of the walls and part of the fortifications. But counterattacking is also a dangerous job. The defending side would dig their own tunnels to intercept the attacking side, which led to underground battles using torches when the space was too small to swing a sword. His underground encounters were carried out with knives, sticks and any temporary weapons available in confined spaces. Some people died in the darkness, some were buried alive by landslides, and some were suffocated to death by the smoke from underground fires. The psychological pressure of a siege battle may be more serious than the physical danger. You will spend months staring at the same enemy's wall, knowing that the people behind them are as desperate as you, and might plan something unpleasant for anyone trying to break through their defense. There is always the possibility of attacks or upgrades every day. Every night, you are afraid that the next day your commander will decide to launch a fierce attack on the city walls, making you climb up the siege ladders and fall into the hail of arrows, stones and boiling liquid, killing the climbers in the most painful way. Time is both your enemy and your defender. When the army was stationed outside the enemy city, the seasons changed. After a long siege, men aged, obviously, and their hair turned white due to stress and malnutrition. Those diseases that should have caused rapid death have lingered on, taking weeks or months to complete their tasks. Wounds that might have healed under better conditions fester and turn gangrene. The siege camp turned into a huge outdoor hospital, where people slowly died from diseases that they could have received proper medical care for. That there was no proper medical care at that time, so they still died. Hunger has an equal impact on the besieged and the besieged. Due to the interference of enemy surprise attacks and bad weather, the supply lines extended very narrowly over long distances. Food is becoming increasingly scarce. The soldiers learned to eat some things that civilians were reluctant to eat, as animal feed, moldy grains, problematic meat, tree roots and bark. These things may be edible or may not be. Cannibalism is not unheard of in a particularly desperate siege, although it is rarely openly discussed. To survive, people have to do what they must do, and survival sometimes requires crossing moral boundaries that peace ethics will never accept. Winter siege is a special form of hell, testing human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Imagine spending months outdoors in medieval clothes, sleeping in tents that are least resistant to cold and storms, and using siege engines that freeze stiff overnight. My fingers and toes were frostbitten. Hypothermia silently takes people's lives and steals their strength until they lie down and never get up again. The ice made the siege operation dangerous, causing people to fall off the city walls and towers. But we can't give up the siege just because the weather is bad. Strategic goals will not be suspended by winter, and the army has to continue fighting despite the casualties caused by the cold. Victory, when it finally comes, often feels like just another form of failure. Capturing a successfully breached city means engaging in close combat with unscrupulous defenders in a confined space. The streets have turned into killing grounds, with enemies lurking at every door and archers at every window. The looting following a successful siege was a recognized atrocity, intended to compensate for the soldiers' months of suffering. That participation in mass murder and rape has left psychological trauma that can never heal. Many veterans of the siege have never recovered from what they did in the final terrifying moment, when the constraints of civilization finally collapsed. That perhaps the worst part of a siege is knowing that everything could be meaningless. The number of failed sieges was greater than that of successful ones. Months of preparation, thousands of casualties and huge expenses may only lead to a strategic retreat, breaking the siege when the defenders prove too stubborn to break through or when rescue forces arrive. All the pain, all the deaths, all the investments in human suffering, apart from filling more graves and emptying more wealth, may have accomplished nothing. Siege battles in the Middle Ages were a gamble with human lives at stake, and families usually won. The design of military technology in the Middle Ages had only one goal, that is, to kill as efficiently as possible by making use of the materials and knowledge available at that time. As a soldier, you will be very familiar with all kinds of weapons, most of which were specially designed to cause the greatest harm to the human body. Medieval weapon artisans were destructive artists. The tools they made could penetrate armor, shatter bones, and separate body parts with astonishing efficiency. Your survival depends on your understanding of these weapons, including the ones you carry and those your enemies use against you. Swords are the most renowned weapons, but they are expensive, difficult to maintain, and require considerable skills to be used effectively. The sword of the Middle Ages was not the elegant dueling weapon that came later. This is a heavy and cruel tool, specifically designed to pierce men and bones with tremendous force. These sword blades are thick and strong, capable of cutting off limbs or splitting helmets, but they become blunt very quickly when used. They will shatter when hit armor at the wrong angle and also break under pressure. A good sword requires the constant maintenance of skilled craftsmen. It is a luxury that most soldiers cannot afford, so you will fight with any sword you can get, which might be second-hand and show the wear and tear from previous battles. Spears and lances are the preferred weapons for infantry, and there are good reasons for this. They are low in manufacturing cost, effective against cavalry, and can be used by soldiers with minimal training. The spear is within your reach, allowing you to attack them before they do. In formation, the spears from a pointed wall that can stop charging horses or advancing infantry. But spear battles are both cruel and exhausting. The wooden stick splits under pressure, leaving you with a useless stick when the enemy approaches in close combat. The metal tip bends, breaks or loosens at a critical moment. If your formation breaks, then in close combat, the spear will become a burden. It is too clumsy for the rapid sprints and parries needed for personal survival. The crossbow revolutionized medieval warfare, entrusting destructive long-range power to soldiers who did not require years of training. Crossbows can penetrate chainmail at distances that would make archers envious. Bolts fly faster and straighter than arrows. The force they strike is strong enough to send a fully armed person flying. However, the loading speed of the crossbow is very slow, making you vulnerable to attacks between shots. These devices are very complex and prone to breakage, especially in humid weather. If the enemy's cavalry reaches your position before you reload, the crossbow will become an expensive stick because it is too light to cause much damage in close combat. Mace and warhammer are specifically designed to deal with armored opponents. These weapons do not require cutting through men or steel plates. They transmit blunt force through armor, turning brain substances into soup and chest cavities into powder. A mace in the right position can penetrate the helmet and kill the wearer immediately without even penetrating the metal. The warhammer concentrates tremendous force on a small point, piercing through armor like a can opener, but these weapons are very tiring to use and require a huge amount of force to swing effectively. Missing the target, the weight of the weapon will make you lose your balance and vulnerable to counterattacks. The axe combines cutting ability and armor minus piercing ability, making it popular among both infantry and cavalry. The battle axe can slash through shields, armors and bones with a single swing. The long nail on the back of the axe can pierce the helmet and also be used for close-range attacks. But it is very difficult to control the axe in battle. Their weight distribution makes them clumsy. If the blade gets stuck in the enemy's shield or armor, you will be disarmed and defenseless. Many soldiers brandishing axes died because their weapons got stuck in the victims' bodies and could not be quickly removed to defend against the next attack. The dagger is a backup weapon for every soldier, specifically designed for close combat when the main weapon fails. These are not ornaments but real combat knives, with long and narrow blades that can slide between the joints of the armor to locate vital organs. The dagger is the last resort, used when the battle turns into a desperate SCUG, in which skill is more important than the will to kill. But short sword fighting is intimate and terrifying. You need to get close enough to smell your opponent's breath and, at the same time, pierce his body with your sword before he strikes you. Many soldiers survived the battle but died during the clearance stage, being stabbed by wounded enemies who were believed to have died safely. Armor is meant to protect you, but medieval defensive gear was a compromise between protection, liability and cost, and usually no one could fully satisfy it. Chainmail is effective for cutting weapons, but it is vulnerable to crushing strikes and precise thrusts. Plate armor offers better protection, but it is very expensive and requires frequent maintenance. Most soldiers make do with what they can afford or get, which is usually not enough to deal with the threats they face. Inappropriate armor is almost worse than no armor at all, restricting movement without providing reliable protection. All the armors are very heavy, increasing the physical burden of battle and fatigue, which may defake a long-earned engagement. The reality of medieval weapons was that they were tools designed for a specific mission, and that mission was to kill as efficiently as possible. They are not ritual items or symbols of honor. They are practical destructive tools, made by those who have a precise understanding of how much force is needed to penetrate the human body and how to concentrate the force on the smallest possible impact point. The use of these weapons not only requires physical skills, but also mental preparation for the intimate violence of hand-to-hand combat. Because the wars in the Middle Ages were not fought at a safe distance, precision-guided ammunition was used. This is personal, cruel, and will never forgive hesitation or restraint. Diseases killed more medieval soldiers than all the swords, spears and arrows combined. The army was the perfect incubator for all plagues, epidemics and pathogens in medieval Europe. When you gather thousands of people who haven't taken a bath in an unhygienic environment, feed them contaminated food and contaminated water, an epidemic is not only possible but also inevitable. When disease attacked the armies of the Middle Ages, it would strike rapidly and fiercely, with a killing efficiency higher than what the most experienced enemy commanders hoped to achieve through conventional military operations. Dysentery may be the most common killer. It is a cruel intestinal infection that causes soldiers to become dehydrated, weakened, eventually die from fluid loss. These symptoms make people feel humiliated and weak. Persistent diarrhea, severe cramps and gradual weakness prevented him from functioning like a soldier. Men will dirty themselves in battle and be unable to control their body functions when fighting for survival. The smell is hard to resist, and the psychological impact reduced to an infant helpless state is often as destructive as the disease itself on the body. Typhus spread like wildfire in the military. It is transmitted by lice, which thrive in crowded and dirty barracks. This disease begins with fever and headache, and then progresses to mental confusion, organ failure and death. The soldiers would roar with fever, and their bodies would shut down system by system. Apart from hope and prayer, there are no other treatments, but it has been proven that both of these methods are significantly ineffective against bacterial infections. The prevalence of typhus can destroy an entire army without the enemy fighting a single battle, leaving commanders with troops that only exist in their own optimistic estimates. Plague is the ultimate nightmare, capable of killing armies, cities and entire kingdoms. When the Black Death hit the military, the result was disastrous. Soldiers will show typical swollen lymph nodes, followed by fever, mental confusion, and die within a few days. The form of pneumonia is even worse, spreading through respiratory droplets and causing death at a terrifying speed. When the plague strikes, the entire battle collapses, and the battlefield is filled with corpses of people who died of disease rather than enemy actions. The soldiers watched helplessly as their comrades minus arms were brutally killed by the invisible enemy, unable to fight against them. The psychological shock was as heavy as the physical loss. Carrera turned the medieval armies into mobile carriers of disease, spreading death wherever they went. This disease breaks out suddenly, causes rapid death, leads to severe dehydration, uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea. Soldiers might be healthy in the morning but die by night, their bodies dried up due to the loss of body fluids. The outbreak of Chow era usually marks the end of military operations, as commanders find that their troops are melting faster than they are recruiting new soldiers. This disease followed trade routes and military movements, turning military logistics into a carrier of mass deaths. SMO is another military killer, especially devastating to the troops encountering it for the first time. This disease begins with fever and body aches, and then develops into a rash covering the entire body. This disease is called a pustule because it is very painful and can cause disfigurement, usually leaving survivors blind or leaving unrecognizable scars. But many people didn't survive. Smallpox caused the death of approximately 30% of the victims, and the mortality rate among malnourished and stressed soldiers was even higher. The army that encountered smallpox was usually disbanded because the soldiers fled to avoid infection and spread the disease to the civilians. Compared with plague and cholera, scurvy seems to be a minor problem, but vitamin C deficiency can be resisted as effectively as any bacterial infection. Soldiers in battle seldom have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. They can only eat pickled foods that lack basic nutrients. Scurvy begins with fatigue and joint pain, and then progresses to bleeding gums, to floss and minus healing wounds. Advanced cases progress to massive hemorrhage and organ failure. An army suffering from scurvy has lost its combat effectiveness before the soldiers actually die. Due to weakness and pain, they are unable to march long distances or fight effectively. The treatment for sick soldiers is at best primitive and often counterproductive. Medieval doctors knew nothing about bacteria and viruses. They attributed diseases to various causes, ranging from bad air to moral decline and the influence of astrology. The treatment methods include bloodlet, which weakens the already ill patient, diarrhea, which aggravates dehydration, and all kinds of herbs, ranging from useless to harmful. Soldiers who survive diseases often do so regardless of medical intervention, rather than because of it. Those lucky people were completely ignored by doctors and left to recover on their own. The impact of epidemics on psychology is huge. Soldiers have always lived in fear of invisible enemies, unable to fight or defend against them. Watching a comrade die of illness but being powerless to help, the trauma caused persisted for a long time, even after the direct threat had passed. Many survivors suffered from what we now call anxiety disorders, depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. However, the military culture of the Middle Ages did not understand psychological casualties and regarded mental health problems as character or moral flaws. No matter what the soldiers witnessed or experienced, they were expected to work normally. Let's discuss the absolute nightmare of medical care on the medieval battlefield. If you are injured in battle, your medical care will be provided by someone who happens to be nearby and is conscious enough to attempt basic first aid. This might be a comrade in arms who learns anatomy by observing what happens when people are cut open. The follower of a camp learned some dubious medical knowledge from previous movements. Or a barber surgeon whose medical training included sharp things going in, blood coming out, and striving to keep patients alive. Surgeries on the battlefield are carried out with any available tools, which are usually knives used for cooking, combat and various other injury-definic purposes. Sterilization is unheard of, so infection is almost inevitable. Anesthesia involves hitting you hard on the head to make you lose consciousness, getting you dead drunk so much that you don't remember the procedure, or simply pinning you to the ground and having a few strong men try an amateur operation. Pain management was primitive and even non-existent, so wounded soldiers often died of shock rather than real injury. Common battlefield wounds include direct cuts from swords piercing the bones, piercings from spears through the torso, deep stings from arrows in the muscle tissue, and crushing injuries from maces that shatter bones into pieces. The treatment options are limited and most of them are ineffective. Deep wounds were sewn together with readily available thread, usually the thread used to repair equipment. Broken bones are made into splints, with wood picked up from siege engines or damaged weapons. Arrow injuries are particularly a problem. Removing arrows usually causes more damage than keeping them. Therefore, many soldiers carried enemy arrows for the rest of their short lives. Amputation is very common and usually fatal. When gangrene enters the body, the standard treatment is to cut the affected limb with a saw, burn the wound with hot iron, and hope that the patient can survive the operation. Most don't. The combined effect of blood loss, shock and infection cause most amputees to die within a few days after surgery. Those who survive often face a life of disability, because there is no social safety net for disabled veterans in the world. In medieval society, there was no need for one-armed soldiers, or one-legged farmers. Disabled veterans could only lead a life of begging and poverty. Infection is the real killer. Although medieval doctors knew nothing about bacteria or proper wound care, they would bandage wounds in any reasonable way. Honey, wine, animal fat, ground herbs, crushed insects, or just dirty cloth. Some of these treatments may work occasionally, but most will worsen the infection. Gangrene is common and usually fatal. Blood poisoning can be fatal to a person several days or weeks after they have survived the initial wound. The infection was accompanied by a depressing fever, delirium and death. A minor wound turned into a death sentence. Pain management is particularly primitive and often cruel. The strongest painkiller is alcohol, but it's not always available. Opium does exist, but it is extremely rare and expensive. Only the rich or those with connections would use it. Most wounded soldiers have to endure any pain caused by their injuries, no matter how long it takes them to recover or die. Medieval battlefield medicine did not have the concept of regarding pain as something that should be treated. Pain is regarded as natural and may even be beneficial to the spirit. Soldiers should endure their pain in silence, for complaining about pain is regarded as unmanly and made dampen the morale of other troops. The psychological trauma caused by medieval medicine was often more serious than the original harm. During surgery, being crushed while conscious, having an amputation without anesthesia, or watching an infection slowly devour your body, all these cause mental trauma that can never heal. Many wounded soldiers did not die from physical injuries but from the despair and fear of medieval medicine. Those who survived often suffered from what we now call severe post-traumatic stress disorder. However, in medieval society, there was no understanding of psychological trauma and no idea how to treat it. Head injuries were particularly problematic because medieval doctors did not understand brain function or skull fractures. Soldiers with head injuries often have to recover on their own, resulting in permanent cognitive impairment, personality changes or death from internal bleeding. Those who survive traumatic brain injury often become completely different people, violent, unpredictable or mentally impotent. But these changes are attributed to moral failure rather than medical conditions, leaving brain-damaged veterans to fend for themselves in a world that regards their disability as a character defect rather than war injury. Perhaps the most tragic thing is that many wounded soldiers did not die because of their injuries, but because they were abandoned by their own troops. The army cannot slow down for wounded soldiers. When the troops continue to advance, seriously wounded soldiers are often left behind. These abandoned people face death due to exposure, hunger or the actions of the enemy. Some were eaten up by scavengers looking for equipment and valuable items. Others stayed for days or weeks and gradually died of infection or internal injuries. The military spirit of the Middle Ages placed the completion of tasks of personal welfare, making wounded soldiers expendable resources rather than people worthy of care and sympathy. Let's take a look at what recreational activities the soldiers of the middle century did during the long and boring intervals of war. Because even in the worst jobs in history, men need some form of entertainment to stay sane. Unfortunately, military entertainment in the Middle Ages was often as cruel and destructive as the wars themselves. Soldiers are young people far from home, often facing danger and living under great pressure. The pleasure they consider to be inclined towards some activities that would scare modern people. But for those whose daily work involves killing, this seems completely reasonable. Gambling was very popular in the armies of the Middle Ages, because soldiers had almost nothing else to spend their meager salaries on, and dice games offered the possibility of winning enough money to buy better equipment or more food. But military gambling in the Middle Ages was no friendly poker night. This is a serious matter and the consequences are very serious. Men will bet everything they have on a single dice, including their weapons and armors. Losers may find themselves facing an unarmed battle, for they have lost their only means of defense. Cheating is very common and often leads to violent confrontation, resulting in more soldier deaths than some minor conflicts. Drinking alcohol is another popular pastime, provided that it can be bought. Medieval armies relied on alcohol as much as they did on food, because fermented beverages were usually safer than water and could relieve them from the constant pressure of military life. But military wine is not a form of social consumption. This is a serious attempt to forget. Soldiers will keep drinking until they can no longer stand, think or remember what they saw in the last battle. Alcohol poisoning is very common. Soldiers who are drunk are very vulnerable to enemy attacks, accidental injuries, or their own wrong decisions. Battles among soldiers are regarded as normal recreational activities, as long as they do not affect military operations. Men would settle disputes through fighting, organize boxing matches with weapons, or simply beat each other for entertainment. These are not friendly sparring practices. These violent conflicts often led to serious injuries or death. However, military culture encourages aggression and violence, so recreational battles are regarded as good training for actual combat. In fact, it has also reduced the effective strength of the military through casualties, which is regarded as an acceptable cost. Sexual entertainment was provided by the followers of the camp, who were a mixture of prostitutes, wives, merchants and other civilians who joined the army for economic or personal reasons. These relationships are often exploitative and violent, reflecting the cruel influence of military culture on human sexual behavior. Rape is very common, whether it is among the followers in the camp or the civilians encountered in the battle. Sexual violence was tacitly regarded as one of the benefits of military service, a reward for enduring the hardships of medieval wars. This psychological harm to both the abuser and the victim has been overlooked by a culture that regards sexual conquest as a natural male behavior. Robbing the corpses of the enemy is both a practical need and a form of public entertainment. After the battle, the soldiers would remove any valuable items from the corpses, such as weapons, armors, jewels, coins, or useful equipment. This kind of clearance is indispensable for soldiers who are under-equipped. It also satisfies the curious instincts of those who have almost nothing. The scramble for the best spoils often leads to so-called battles among allies. The process of searching the corpses also exposed the soldiers to diseases, as many of the corpses were victims of plagues or had other infectious diseases that could be transmitted to the living. Telling stories and singing are milder forms of entertainment that help maintain morale in long-term battles. Veterans often recount past battle stories, frequently exaggerating their heroic deeds while describing the cowardice of their enemies or former comrades. These stories have multiple uses. They entertain the audience, offer informal tactical education, and enhance group identity and cohesion. But they also continue the myths about the glory and honor of war, which have little to do with the cruel reality of medieval battles. Religious ceremonies have to some extent alleviated the constant pressure and moral compromises in military life. The soldiers would pray together, attend mass when the priest was present, and celebrate religious festivals through special festivals or ceremonies. These activities offer psychological comfort and remind people of the moral standards that military life often violates. The military religion of the Middle Ages was often eroded by violence, just as it was in other aspects of military life. Prayers for victory usually involve asking God to help slaughter the enemy, and after religious ceremonies, there may be some activities that go against the moral principles claimed by the soldiers. Sports competitions like wrestling, running or strength matches provide an outlet for the competitive instinct and help maintain physical condition. Compared with other military entertainment activities, these activities are relatively harmless, although they often involve gambling and may escalate into more serious violence. Champions gain status and respect within their troops, offering some personal achievements in an environment where personal identity is submerged in military ranks and collective goals. Perhaps the most tragic thing is that many soldiers amuse themselves by abusing prisoners, civilians, or animals. Continuous danger and repeated exposure to violent psychological stress usually manifest as abusive behavior towards any weaker or more vulnerable person. Torture, maiming, and murder were sometimes purely for entertainment, which reflected the complete moral corruption caused to the participants by medieval wars. These activities temporarily alleviated the feelings of powerlessness and victimization by making the soldiers themselves victims, but they also contributed to a cruel cycle, causing the wars of the Middle Ages to cause such great damage to human dignity and social order. Even in the darkest work of medieval history, human nature needed some form of rest, companionship, and hope for the future. However, the recreational activities of medieval soldiers reflected the corrupt and violent world they lived in, providing temporary escape through these activities, which often caused more harm than cure. Entertainment became another casualty of medieval warfare, distorted into a form of cruel treatment of both participants and victims. The worst jobs don't even allow for proper downtime. Everything was contaminated by violence and despair, which was a characteristic of military life in the Middle Ages. Although military service in the Middle Ages was terrifying, true heroes did emerge occasionally. These people have transcended brutality and corruption, demonstrating courage, leadership, and humanity in the impossible. But heroes in medieval wars were like this. They usually die young and tragically, unknown to all. This pragmatic world that rewards selfishness, betrayal, and ruthlessness, the qualities that make them heroes, selfless, loyal, and morally courageous, are oft and fatal flaws. Heroes create inspiring legends only after they die safely, but they set a terrifying example for those soldiers who were striving to survive. The true military heroes of the Middle Ages were not knights in romantic literature. They are ordinary soldiers who share rations with their sick comrades minus arms, sergeants who protect their soldiers from being abused by officers, and veterans who bring their wounded friends to safe areas under enemy fire. These people demonstrated extraordinary courage and compassion, both of which were hindered in this situation, for their heroism is often unknown to history, with no chronicles to record it and no monuments to commemorate it. They died in obscurity and were soon forgotten, with only those who were saved by them or made their lives bearable remembering them. The contradiction of military heroism in the Middle Ages lies in the fact that the most heroic acts are often the ones with the least military significance. Refusing to participate in atrocities, protecting civilians from abuse, or treating enemy prisoners humanely requires more courage than engaging in combat. These moral positions may lead to punishment, social exclusion, or execution due to dissatisfaction. Heroes who attempt to maintain humanity in inhumane systems often pay the ultimate price for their principles, but they proved that even in the worst circumstances, some people could transcend the brutality and corruption of medieval warfare. The leadership of small units often falls into the hands of unofficial heroes. Experienced soldiers are responsible for training new recruits, maintaining morale, making tactical decisions, and keeping their comrades minus arms alive. These people were not appointed. They won these honors by demonstrating their abilities and showing sincere care for their comrades. They built a bridge between soldiers and officers, transforming impossible orders into achievable goals and protecting their subordinates from the most serious military hierarchy. Thanks to these informal leaders, many troops survived. Their names were never recorded, but their influence saved countless lives. Religious beliefs have given rise to another type of military hero. Priests, pastors, and devout soldiers, despite constantly being exposed to violence and moral corruption, still adhere to their spiritual principles. These people offer comfort to the dying, exercise the last rites for the deceased, and bring hope to those who have lost faith in everything else. They proved that religious belief can coexist with military needs, although often at a huge personal cost. While others fled to safe places, many religious heroes died serving the victims of the plague or caring for wounded soldiers. Some heroes come from very pragmatic soldier teams who understand that maintaining the combat effectiveness of the troops is more important than personal honors or promotions. These people made some mundane decisions to prevent disasters, ensure adequate food and water supplies, properly maintain equipment, or realize that when to retreat was the only wise choice. They saved more lives through meticulous planning and risk management, rather than those magnificent heroes who save more lives through spectacular and heroic acts. But their contributions are often overlooked, because they prevent problems rather than solve them dramatically. The tragedy of medieval military heroism lies in the fact that it is of no use in the face of systemic atrocities and institutional corruption. Individual courage and compassion cannot change the fundamental nature of medieval warfare, nor can they alter the society that gave rise to war. Heroes can save some lives, protect some innocent people, or maintain a bitter human dignity in a disgraceful environment. They are unable to reform the system that causes these situations. Their sacrifices were meaningful to the individuals they helped, but insignificant in the context of medieval military culture. Many potential heroes were defeated by the system before achieving any meaningful accomplishments. Young people with idealistic views on honor and responsibility find that wars in the Middle Ages rewarded cynicism, brutality, and selfishness. Some people adapt by giving up their own principles. Others were destroyed by the conflict between their beliefs and their environment. A few individuals who can maintain both effectiveness and humanity are rare exceptions, and their existence highlights the moral bankruptcy of the systems they serve. Even successful heroes often pay a terrifying personal price for their achievements. Those who save the lives of their comrades minus arms might be disabled for life due to injuries sustained during rescue operations. Leaders who protect their subordinates from abuse may find their careers ruined by vengeful superiors. Religious heroes who uphold their beliefs may feel guilty for witnessing or participating in violence. Heroism in medieval warfare was always costly, and these costs were usually borne by the heroes themselves rather than by the institutions that created their need for sacrifice. Perhaps the most tragic thing is that many military heroes of the Middle Ages believed they had failed when they died. Those who have saved dozens of lives focus on those they cannot save. The leader who prevented the disaster blamed himself for causing inevitable casualties. The cruel nature of medieval warfare made it impossible to achieve a complete victory. Therefore, even the most successful heroes bear the burden of failure. When they died, they felt they were not good enough and failed to realize that their imperfect efforts had had a profound impact in an imperfect world. The legacy of medieval military heroes does not lie in the battles they won or the enemies they defeated, but in their proof that even in the worst circumstances in history, human dignity can survive. They proved that when physical courage is necessary, moral courage is possible, compassion can coexist with ability, and some principles are worth sacrificing, even if no one sees them. Their example reminds us that heroism does not lie in winning. It's about striving to do the right thing when it seems impossible to do it. Death was the only inevitable outcome of military service in the Middle Ages, and its eldom came quickly or neatly. The ways in which soldiers died in the Middle Ages were diverse, from illness, hunger, exposure, wound infection, enemy weapons, friendly firepower accidents, executions, and simple exhaustion. But perhaps worse than the certainty of death is the uncertainty of how and when it will come. The soldiers knew that every day could be their last, every order could be a death sentence for them, and every battle could be one they couldn't survive. Death in battle was actually one of the more benevolent endings that medieval soldiers could choose. A sword piercing the heart, a crossbow shot at the head, or a mace smashing the skull can all quickly end the pain. However, for every soldier who died immediately in battle, there weren't any more who died from wounds that could be easily treated by modern medicine. Infection turns a small wound into a death sentence. Internal bleeding caused by blunt force trauma can lead to death within days or weeks of injury. Gangrene first devoured the limbs and then the body. When the victim was conscious and aware of his deteriorating condition, he spread decay through the living flesh. Disease is a huge equalizer that kills both veterans and new recruits with the same efficiency. A plague can leave an army empty-handed without a fight. Cholera attacked without any warning and killed healthy soldiers within hours, turning them into mummies. Typhus spread in camps full of lice, causing fever, mental confusion and death. Dysentery can lead to dehydration and fatigue. It is a slow and humiliating death that takes away the victim's dignity before claiming their life. These diseases show no mercy to courage, skill and experience. They kill people at will and ruthlessly. Hunger is another common cause of death, especially during long battles or failed sieges. Logistics in the Middle Ages was primitive. Armies often went beyond supply lines or found themselves cut off from their food sources. Soldiers will gradually become emaciated, and their bodies will consume muscles and organ tissues in despair. They starve to death is painful and protracted, accompanied by hallucinations, dementia and the gradual cessation of physical functions. People die from swollen stomachs because they eat grass, tree bark, leather or anything else that might provide more calories and prolong their lives by a few more hours. Exposure was fatal in medieval armies that lacked sufficient clothing and shelter. In the winter campaign, hypothermia claimed the lives of soldiers, stole their warmth and consciousness, until they lay in the snow and never got up again. During summer marches, heat stroke can lead to the death of soldiers, and when body temperature rises to an unbearable level, it can cause organ failure. Frostbite can turn fingers and toes black or green, leading to amputation, which is often fatal. Nature is an unforgivable enemy that needs no weapons and shows no mercy to human weaknesses. Soldiers who violate military law or dissatisfy their commanders are always likely to be executed. Deserters, cowardice, disobedience to orders, theft, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time can all lead to the death penalty. These executions are public affairs aimed at maintaining discipline and preventing others from committing similar crimes again. Hanging, beheading, or shooting with crossbows can all cause death row inmates to die quickly, but the psychological impact on witnesses may last for several years. The soldiers knew that if there was military or personal need, their commander might order them to be killed. The number of medieval soldiers killed in accidents was astonishing, which reflected the danger of military equipment and military activities. The siege engine malfunctioned and crushed the operator to death. The weapon broke under pressure, injuring the soldier using it. The horse threw the rider off or stepped on the trainer. The campfire spread out and burned the sleeping people alive. Simple activities, such as sharpening knives, maintaining equipment or preparing food, can all lead to cuts, stab wounds or burns, which can cause infection and even death. Military life in the Middle Ages was extremely dangerous. Even ordinary missions carried a significant risk of death. Perhaps the most tragic thing is that many medieval soldiers died from preventable causes, which were due to ignorance rather than the actions of the enemy. Drinking contaminated water can lead to fatal diseases, while clean water could have prevented them. Eating spoiled food can lead to poisoning, but proper storage can avoid it. Poor wound care turns minor injuries into life-threatening infections, which basic sanitation facilities could have prevented. These deaths represent the ultimate futility of medieval military services. It became common in the following centuries to die not for strategic goals or noble causes, but for a lack of knowledge. The way of death often reflects the nature of medieval military services themselves. Cruel, arbitrary, and meaningless, soldiers seldom heroically sacrifice their lives to defend important positions or achieve significant goals. They died of diseases they couldn't understand, wounds they couldn't heal, or orders they couldn't refuse. Their deaths have no significance other than easing the burden on military logistics and making room for new recruits. And the new recruits will soon die in the same meaningless way. Military deaths in the Middle Ages were particularly tragic because they wasted human potential. If these young people had lived in a more peaceful era, or been born in a different environment, they might have become farmers, craftsmen, merchants, or scholars. On the contrary, they passed away before making any meaningful contribution to human civilization. Their talents and potential have been eliminated by a system that only regards them as expendable resources in conflicts that they seldom understand or care about. A mass grave was the last insult to medieval soldiers, who were often buried in unmarked pits, along with dozens or even hundreds of other casualties. There are no individual tombstones, no personal monuments, and no recognition of their service or sacrifice. They simply vanished from the earth, forgotten by history, with only their families mourning. They might never know what happened to their sons, fathers, or brothers. Medieval wars consumed humanity like fuel, consuming human lives for power conflicts, and these conflicts usually only changed the way the nobility taxed the peasants. The promise of an afterlife offered some comfort to dying soldiers in the Middle Ages, although even religious consolation was tarnished by the violence and moral compromise of military service. Those who have been killing people all their lives are worried about the destination of their souls after death. Those involved in atrocities against civilians or prisoners question that no prayer or confession can make up for everything they have done in the name of military need. Death relieved people of the physical pain brought by medieval wars, but it also brought about the judgment of those who violated moral principles, and these people had always been taught to value these moral principles. Survival is possible, but the cost is often more desirable than death. Veterans who experienced medieval wars often suffered from permanent disabilities due to poor wound healing or organ damage. They suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but in medieval society, this was regarded as a sign of weak character or moral decline. Many survivors turned to alcohol or other forms of self-medication in an attempt to numb their memories of what they saw undid during their military service. In medieval society, there was no concept of veteran benefits, nor was there social support for veterans. The situation of disabled veterans was particularly difficult. Those who lost limbs, suffered brain injuries, or developed chronic diseases during their military service have to take care of themselves in a world where physical ability is valued above all else. Many people became beggars, vividly reminding us of the true cost of medieval warfare. Others turned to plundering, using their military skills to plunder the civilians they had once been ordered to protect. Psychological harm is often more serious than physical harm. Veterans who have survived multiple battles often exhibit severe symptoms, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, intrusive memory, nightmares, excessive vigilance, emotional numbness, and rage. However, the culture of the Middle Ages had no understanding of psychological trauma and did not know how to treat it. These people are expected to reintegrate into a peaceful society as if nothing had happened, despite having lived in an environment that rewards brutality and punishes compassion for many years. When veterans return from the battlefield, their family relationships have undergone fundamental changes because of their experiences. The wives found that the strangers they married were either drunk, or furious, or staring blankly at the sky for hours without saying a word. Children are afraid of becoming unpredictable and sometimes even dangerous fathers. The skills for survival in a military environment, aggression, suspicion, and emotional detachment, make a peaceful family life almost impossible. Many marriages break down under pressure, leaving veterans even more isolated from normal interpersonal relationships. For those whose only market skill is to kill, reintegrating into economic life is equally difficult. Civilian employers rarely need expertise in siege warfare or hand-to-hand combat. Veterans often find themselves competing for agricultural jobs with young people who haven't left the farm for many years. Those who had learned a trade before joining the army found that years of absence deprived them of skills and professional connections. The economy that gave rise to medieval armies left little room for the survivors of these armies. Some veterans have found meaning in their religious life. They join monasteries or become hermits, attempting to atone for their military careers. These people sought psychotherapy to treat psychological traumas that medieval medicine could not heal. However, even religious retreats cannot erase the memory of violence, nor can they bring complete peace to those hearts shaped by years of trauma. Many religious veterans struggle with guilt, shame, and spiritual despair, which no amount of prayer or repentance can completely resolve. Others have transformed their military experience into a new profession as mercenaries, selling their skills to the highest bidder and perpetuating the cycle of violence that harms them. These people found that war was the only environment that made them feel comfortable, the only place where their damaged personalities and violent skills were valued rather than feared. They transformed into professional soldiers, shuffling between conflicts, seeking employers who hired them to do what the medieval society trained them to do, to kill others efficiently and without regret. The tragedy of medieval military survival lies in the fact that it often felt like a punishment rather than a reward. Those who have experienced the worst in human history find themselves unable to adapt to normal life, with physical and mental scars on their bodies, which marks them as unique and dangerous. They survived the worst jobs, only to find that survival itself brought all kinds of pain. In many respects, veterans were the ultimate victims of medieval wars. They are alive, but have changed forever. They are free, but they can never truly escape the wars that defined and hurt them. As we are about to conclude our nightmarish journey of serving in the medieval army, it is necessary for us to reflect on what this cruel history has taught us about human nature, social organization, and the true cost of war. Experiences of medieval soldiers reveal the extreme suffering and endurance of humanity, showing us how ordinary people were shaped into almost unrecognizable human beings by special circumstances. These people are not monsters. They were farmers, artisans, and laborers, and they were transformed by a system that valued destruction over creation and death over life. The military experience of the Middle Ages also proved the importance of institutions and social structures in shaping human behavior. If those who committed atrocities in the war had been born into different environments or social systems, they might have led peaceful and productive lives. The wars in the Middle Ages created conditions for the cruel treatment of war participants, turning potential upright people into tools of violence and destruction. The fault does not lie with people themselves, but with the system that generates and rewards their worst impulses while punishing their good sides. Technology played a crucial role in military services during the Middle Ages, making them so terrifying, but not in the way we imagined. Due to the lack of effective medical technology, communication systems, and logistical capabilities, medieval armies were often on the verge of collapse because of disease, hunger, and organizational failure. Modern military forces provide their personnel with standards of care, supplies, and support that medieval soldiers could never have imagined. Technology has not made war more humane, but it has indeed enhanced the survivability of the military. The economic foundation of medieval warfare caused much suffering to ordinary soldiers. The feudal system that provided military labor also ensured that those who fought received the least compensation, while those who ordered the battles reaped the majority of the benefits. In the Middle Ages, soldiers fought and sacrificed to protect wealth and power that they would never share, to defend a system that only brings them pain and premature death. The disconnection between sacrifice and reward has created an institutionalized form of exploitation, which the modern labor movement regards as familiar, although fortunately not as fatal. Religious and cultural factors also contributed to the hardships of military service in the Middle Ages. The worldview of the Middle Ages held that suffering was beneficial to the spirit and violence was approved by the gods, which provided an ideological justification for the system that ruthlessly consumed human life. The soldiers were told that their suffering was meaningful, even though this meaning had never been explained or rewarded. The promise of a heavenly reward for earthly service offers psychological comfort, but it does not reduce actual suffering or improve material conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the military experience of the Middle Ages has demonstrated to us humanity's resilience under extreme pressure and its ability to maintain moral conduct, even in the most corrupt environments. Despite systematic atrocities, some medieval soldiers maintained their humanity, protected the weak, and demonstrated the courage to defend principles rather than merely personal survival. These examples remind us that even in the worst minus-case scenario, personal choice and moral initiative still exist, although they may bring terrifying personal costs. The legacy of medieval military service extends far beyond its own historical period. Traumatized veterans, militarized societies, and the glorification of violence that emerged during medieval wars shaped European culture in the following centuries. We link many problems to the later stage. The prevalence of private wars, the romanticization of military violence, and the acceptance of social atrocities can all be traced back to the systems and attitudes formed during the military era of the Middle Ages. Modern military services, although still dangerous and difficult, exist in a completely different universe from the predecessor of the Middle Ages. Professional armies, medical security, reliable supply systems, rules of engagement, and post-minus retirement benefits represented advancements that medieval soldiers could never have imagined. The transformation of military service from a death penalty to a dangerous but controllable profession reflect broader social progress in human rights, medical knowledge and institutional accountability. However, the experiences of the Middle Ages also remind us of how fragile these improvements were, and these conditions made military services in the Middle Ages so terrifying. Social inequality, technological limitations, institutional corruption and cultural acceptance of atrocities still exist in various forms and may recur similar pain where appropriate. Understanding how the military system in the Middle Ages developed and operated helps us recognize and prevent the social conditions that might lead to similar exploitation and barbaric behavior in the future. The personal stories of medieval soldiers, although most of them have not been recorded, represent countless human tragedies that were regarded as normal and acceptable by the society at that time. Every person who dies from illness, every disabled wound, and every psychological breakdown represents the destruction of a unique individual who has his own dreams, his relationships, and his potential contribution to human civilization. The scale of this waste is almost incomprehensible, but it reminds us of the value of a peaceful and prosperous society, which most of us now take for granted. When we conclude our research on why being a soldier in the Middle Ages was truly the worst job in history, we should bear in mind that if this pain taught us to cherish and protect the institutions, technologies and social arrangements that prevent such widespread human suffering, then this pain is not meaningless. The sacrifice of soldiers in the Middle Ages was involuntary and mostly unruffled. However, their suffering can powerfully remind us of how much progress human civilization has made and how much we will lose if we allow this progress to regress. Tonight, as you lie in the cozy beds of your warm homes, enjoying clean water, abundant food, effective medicine, and legal protection that medieval soldiers never enjoyed, perhaps you can think of those unknown people who have endured the worst things in human history. Their deaths were to enable us to live a better life, although this was by no means their choice or intention. The legacy they left behind is our duty. We have the obligation to ensure that the next generation will no longer face the systematic cruelty they experienced in their short and cruel lives. 15,157. The story of medieval soldiers is ultimately a human story, one about pain, endurance, and the complex interaction between individual initiative and social power. When studying their worst jobs ever, we not only learned about the history of the Middle Ages, but also about whether the lives of ordinary people were bearable or unbearable under special circumstances. In this understanding, we are both humble about our own historical moments and determined to protect the fragile achievements that separate our world from theirs. The stories of medieval soldiers not only reveal the depth of human suffering, but also the extraordinary resilience that made some people endure unbearable pain. The environment these people are facing should have completely destroyed the human spirit. However, many people have found ways to maintain hope, loyalty, and even sympathy in systemic atrocities. Their experiences tell us about the extreme and human adaptability and the terrifying cost of social systems that regard people as consumable resources rather than valuable individuals. That before we wrap up this journey through the medieval nightmare, let's take a look at some specific examples to make these historical realities clearer. It is sometimes when we look at certain specific events, specific battles, and the stories of individuals who have survived in some way over centuries, the universal horror of medieval military service becomes even clearer. These details help us understand that what we are discussing is not merely the abstract power of history, but the real human beings who suffered, endured and died in ways that still have the power to touch us today. Think of the Battle of Agi Not in 1415. It is usually regarded as a glorious victory for the British, but the ordinary soldiers who actually participated in the battle had a completely different experience. Sometimes when we examine specific events, battles and individual stories that have been passed down over centuries, the universal horror of medieval military service becomes even clearer. These details help us understand that what we are discussing is not merely the abstract forces of history, but the real human beings who suffered, endured and died in ways that still shock us today. Think of the Battle of Arques in Palais in 1415. It is usually regarded as a glorious victory for the British, but the ordinary soldiers who actually participated in the battle had a completely different experience. The British army had been marching in the hostile area for several weeks, suffering from dysentery and getting themselves dirty as they walked on the road. Many soldiers were barefoot because their shoes were lost in the mud in the French countryside. They were exhausted and malnourished, outnumbered by the French army, which seemed to stretch all the way to the horizon. The famous British longbow men, in later records, were romanticized. In fact, there were some sick farmers who were forced into service and obtained weapons that they would hardly ever use. Before that day, many people had never shot at human targets. When the French cavalry charged through the muddy battlefield, these archers did not consider honor, the king, or the country. What they were thinking about was immortality and that their internal organs would still be inside for the next few minutes. The arrows they shot were not the precise shots of a marksman. They were panicked farmers who were taught to shoot quickly and frequently. When the French knight fell off his horse and was trapped in the mud by his expensive armor, the British soldiers did not engage in chivalrous combat. They killed helpless enemies with daggers and mallets, pierced through the joints of armor, and smashed skulls with any blunt object at hand. This is not a war. This was a massacre carried out by those cruel people who accepted the need to survive and gave up every civilized instinct they once had. The glorious victory was actually a nightmare. Muddy, bloody and desperate people killed each other in the most effective way. Or consider the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099, where religious fanaticism combined with military despair gave rise to the most serious atrocities in medieval military history. The Crusaders marched in hostile regions for 3 years and lost many people due to disease, hunger and continuous conflicts. When they reached Jerusalem, they were no longer devout pilgrims leaving Europe. They are seasoned killers. They know that kindness is a luxury and they can't afford it. The siege lasted for more than a month, with both sides suffering from high temperatures, thirst and diseases. The Crusader soldiers had to travel miles in search of water sources, while also enduring the artillery fire of the city's defenders. Many people died of dehydration before facing the enemy's weapons. When the city wall was finally breached, the outcome was not liberation or religious victory. This was a 3-day island carnival that even medieval chroniclers accustomed to brutal wars were shocked by. For years, the soldiers had been told that they were fighting for God, and they used this reason to do things that God would not approve of. The consequences of war revealed the true impact of military service in the Middle Ages on human spirit. Many Crusader veterans were unable to adapt to a peaceful life again after returning home. What they have seen and done will trouble their dreams and poison their relationships. Some people become hermits, attempting to atone for all that they have witnessed. Others turn to plundering, using their military skills to prey to the civilians they had vowed to protect. A church that sent them to the battlefield prayed for their souls, but it offered no practical help to their wounded hearts. The military records of the Middle Ages, when they existed, told similar stories time and again. In 1209, during the siege of Carcassonne by the Albigense Crusaders, a large number of soldiers died of dysentery while besieging a city they knew little about. They should hate. The Battle of Tutton in 1461 was a battle during the Wars of the Roses. At that time, the snowstorm was so severe that people could not see the enemy until they were close enough, making the battle more like a mutual assassination rather than an organized war. The 100 Years' War produced countless examples of the worst military experiences in the Middle Ages. The British army, expecting a quick victory, landed in France, only to find themselves trapped in hostile areas for months or years, gradually becoming emaciated due to illness and malnutrition. The Chivo tactics employed by both sides, the systematic destruction of enemy territory, has turned soldiers into economic terrorists. Their job is to burn crops, slaughter livestock, intimidate civilians, and make them submit. These movements gave rise to a generation of men who recognized that survival required giving up moral constraints and accepting systemic cruelty. Veterans of the 100 Years' War formed the core of mercenary companies, which plagued Europe for decades. They sold their services to anyone they could afford and brought their brutality on the battlefield to every conflict they were involved in. They have been transformed by their military service into something created by medieval society, but beyond its control. The fate of prisoners of war in medieval wars illustrates another aspect of military services that has largely been eliminated in modern warfare. Captured soldiers were confronted with death, maiming, enslavement, or ransom demands that their families could not afford. Those lucky ones were killed soon after the battle ended. Those unfortunate people will be tortured, publicly executed, or made slaves. Many medieval wars ended with large minor-scale executions of prisoners. This was not because the commanders were inherently evil, but because keeping prisoners alive was expensive and potentially dangerous. The military law of the Middle Ages was so strict that modern people cannot understand it. Its purpose was to maintain discipline through terror rather than justice. Soldiers may be executed for cowardice, desertion, theft, disobedience to orders, or simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Court trials are brief matters and their outcomes are usually predetermined. The appeal does not exist. Military trials are swift, cruel, and final. The threat of the death penalty was used to motivate soldiers, otherwise they might refuse suicide orders or give up hopeless careers. The details of punishment were another aspect of medieval military service that modern armies have abandoned. Soldiers who violate the rules and regulations may be assigned to perform particularly dangerous tasks: lead the commando team, operate the siege engine under artillery fire, or act as a messenger crossing enemy territory. These tasks are death sentences disguised as military needs, a way to eliminate problem soldiers while maintaining the illusion of military discipline and order. The seasonality of medieval warfare brought pain to professional soldiers as they were unable to return to civilian posts in winter. These people formed the core of the mercenary company, leading a hard life during the off-minus season, surviving on bandits, extortion, and any job they could find. They have received violent training and have no idea of any other way to make a living. Trapped in the cycle of war, they have exhausted their entire adult lives. The attendants in the camp represent another forgotten aspect of military service in the Middle Ages. Women, children, and non-minors combatants who joined the military for economic or personal reasons. These people shared many hardships of military life but received no limited benefits. They are vulnerable to diseases, enemy attacks, and abuse by the soldiers they serve. Many people were widows or orphans from previous wars, trapped in military life by circumstances beyond their control. The economic impact of military service on medieval families was devastating and long-lasting. When men are conscripted into the army, their farms, shops, and handicrafts are either abandoned or left to family members who may lack the skills or resources to sustain them. Many families lost their main breadwinners and never recovered economically, even if these people eventually came back from the campaign. Military service has led to a cycle of poverty that has lasted for several generations. The military engine, earring in the Middle Ages, was ingenious. It was built on the backs of soldiers, who not only carried out combat tasks, but also served as manual laborers. Building fortifications, constructing fortifications, and maintaining supply lines required a great deal of physical labor, which was carried out by those who were already exhausted from marching and fighting. This additional burden destroyed the physical and mental health of soldiers, resulting in a high casualty rate in medieval wars. The logistics of medieval armies was so primitive that simple activities, such as finding food, water, and shelter, became the main tactical challenge that consumed most of the army's energy and resources. Soldiers spend more time looking for supplies than fighting, and logistical support kills more people than enemy weapons. The continuous struggle for basic survival leaves little energy for actual military operations, turning campaigns into extended exercises of collective endurance rather than strategic maneuvering. The weather was another enemy that medieval soldiers could neither confront nor defeat. They could only endure it. The winter campaign is a test of human endurance, exceeding the reasonable limit. Summer surgeries bring heat stroke, dehydration, and diseases that run rampant in warm weather. The rain turned the road into an impassable quagmire, making the siege operation impossible. Heavy snow blocked the mountain pass and trapped the army in hostile areas. In the Middle Ages, soldiers had to fight not only against human enemies, but also against equally lethal and unpredictable natural forces. The psychological warfare of medieval armies involved systematic attempts to dampen the morale of the enemy through cruelty and intimidation. The head was nailed to sharp spikes. The prisoner was punished under the watchful eyes of his defense attorney. The atrocities were carried out to have a psychological impact on the enemy troops. That this psychological war had an equally significant impact on both the perpetrators and the victims, dealing a cruel blow to the soldiers who participated in or witnessed systemic atrocities. The tactics that win wars also destroy the humanity of those who use them. The communication of medieval armies was so primitive that soldiers often did not know what they were fighting for, who they were fighting against, or whether one of their sides was winning or losing in a larger conflict. Orders are passed down through an oral command system, but they often collapse under pressure. The battle plan is very simple because complex coordination is impossible. Soldiers fight and sacrifice for reasons they do not understand, obey orders they cannot question, and serve political goals that have never been told. Armor and equipment defined military services in the Middle Ages and told their own stories of human suffering. Male holes weighs 50 pounds or more, and the distribution of his shoulders and back is awkward, causing permanent spinal damage. The helmet restricts vision and hearing, making the battle even more disoriented and terrifying. The weapon is heavy, unbalanced and requires tremendous power to be used effectively. The equipment that was supposed to protect and empower medieval soldiers often became another source of their physical pain and tactical limitations. Battlefield medicine in the Middle Ages usually killed patients faster than their wounds. Surgical techniques are based on speculation and superstition rather than on anatomical knowledge. Infection is inevitable due to poor sanitary conditions and a lack of understanding of disease transmission. Apart from alcohol, which is often unavailable, there is no pain management. Many wounded soldiers would rather die than receive medieval treatment because they knew that the treatment might be worse than the disease itself. In medieval society, the social stigma of military service brought more problems to soldiers and veterans. War was regarded as a necessary sin rather than a glorious profession, and civilians often looked at soldiers with suspicion and fear. This social isolation makes it more difficult for those who have already been traumatized by military experiences to readjust to a peaceful life. After returning to their home country, they became strangers in their own communities, and their services were marked as dangerous and potentially unstable. Religious conflicts added another layer of complexity to military services in the Middle Ages. Because soldiers were often required to take part in wars they considered guilty or unjust, the doctrine of violence in the medieval church was contradictory and perplexing, both condemning murder and blessing war. This has created a moral dilemma for those soldiers who take religious beliefs seriously, forcing them to make a choice between military duty and spiritual redemption. Many veterans are struggling with guilt and religious despair, which no pastor's pardon can solve. The international nature of medieval warfare meant that soldiers often found themselves fighting against enemies who spoke different languages and followed different customs in foreign lands. This cultural isolation increases the psychological pressure of military service, as men find themselves not only isolated from their families but also from all familiar and comfortable things. The foreign environment brings additional dangers, unfamiliar diseases, different climates, and hostile groups that regard all soldiers as invaders regardless of their set goals. Military discipline in the Middle Ages was maintained through a system of collective punishment, where every soldier was held accountable for the actions of his comrades. If one person flees, his entire force may face a reduced ration or a dangerous mission. This has caused internal tension and distrust, undermining the cohesion and morale of the troops. Soldiers learning to monitor and control each other's behavior, turning military units into a society of mutual supervision, where friendship and loyalty were contaminated by fear and suspicion. For many soldiers, the aftermath of medieval wars might have been the most painful part of their service, walking in the fields full of corpses and disabled bodies, many of which were friends and comrades, while searching for available equipment and ensuring that the enemy was actually dead. This caused lasting psychological trauma. After the war, the scents, scenes and sounds of the battlefield would haunt the veterans for the rest of their lives, appearing in nightmares and flashbacks that medieval medicine could neither treat nor understand. As our long journey through the military hardships of the Middle Ages draws to a close, we return to a fundamental question: how could humanity create and maintain systems that are so destructive to their own kind? Part of the reason lies in the social and economic structure of medieval society, which concentrated power in the hands of those who had never personally experienced the consequences of their military decisions. The lords who ordered the battle led comfortable lives while their soldiers died in pain. The king who declared war enjoyed a feast while their army was starving on the battlefield. But the answer also lies in human beings' extraordinary adaptability and endurance under extreme pressure. The soldiers of the Middle Ages experienced things they shouldn't have, but survived because humans are much more resilient than we usually realize. They found ways to maintain hope, friendship and even humor, although the environment seemed destined to destroy all three. Their survival is not only physical but also psychological, as they have developed coping mechanisms that enable them to function in an environment that goes against human lifestyles. The legacy of medieval military service extends far beyond its immediate historical period, influencing people's attitudes towards violence, authority and individual rights, and still exists to this day. The glorification of war, the acceptance of hierarchical authority structures, and the willingness to sacrifice personal welfare for collective goals that emerged in medieval culture all originated from the military institutions that we have been studying. Understanding this period of history helps us recognize these influences of our own era and make wiser choices about the type of society we want to create and maintain. The technological advancements that ultimately made military service less terrifying were not driven by humanitarian considerations, but by practical needs. Better medical care, more sophisticated logistics and more effective weapons have been developed because they have enhanced the efficiency of the military, not because they have reduced human suffering. Alleviating pain is a beneficial side effect rather than the main goal. This reminds us that the progress of human welfare often depends on the establishment of a system where humanitarian outcomes are consistent with practical incentives. The military experience of the Middle Ages also demonstrated the significance of institutional accountability and individual rights in preventing systematic abuse of humanity. Medieval soldiers had no recourse to abuse because they did not have the rights that the authorities had to respect. Their pain is legitimate, recognized and regarded as normal by the society that created it. Although modern military institutions are still not perfect, they operate under the constraints of land morality, providing some protection for individual soldiers. These constraints were completely non-existent in the military system of the Middle Ages. Perhaps most importantly, studying the military service system of the Middle Ages reminds us of the preciousness of peace, prosperity and individual freedom, which many of us now take for granted. These conditions are neither natural nor automatic. They are the products of centuries of struggle, innovation and institutional development. If we do not actively protect and improve them, these achievements may be lost. The experiences of medieval soldiers tell us what life would be like when these protective measures failed and why they were worth protecting. We can never know individual stories, the last thoughts of dying soldiers, the dreams of veterans struggling with trauma, and the hopes of young people who have never returned home remind us that history is not merely about great power and abstract trends. It tells the experiences of countless individuals, most of which have not been recorded or forgotten. But for those who have gone through these experiences, they are all real and meaningful. Every soldier in the Middle Ages had his own story, his own relationships, his own hopes and fears. Their collective experiences represent millions of individual tragedies, which are regarded as normal and acceptable by their society. As we prepare to conclude our examination of human cruelty and endurance, let us remember that the same species that created the terror of medieval warfare also created the technologies, institutions and ideas that ultimately made such widespread suffering unnecessary. Human beings can both do evil and do good, and often this happens simultaneously. The military experience of the Middle Ages has shown us aspects of this ability, reminding us that our choices on how to organize society and how to treat each other have a profound impact on human well-being. The rest job in history has come to an end, but as long as humanity makes a choice between power, violence and the value of an individual's life, its lessons will still have practical significance. The way we remember medieval soldiers is not by praising their sufferings, but by drawing lessons from them. Through efforts to create such a world in which such systematic barbaric acts against humanity become impossible rather than inevitable, their deaths were basically meaningless in their own times. But if we use their experience to create something better, they can also gain meaning from our experience. So as you sleep comfortably in warm bedding tonight, away from illness and violence, protected by systems and technologies that medieval soldiers could never have imagined, please remember that this comfort is the price paid by several generations who have suffered, so we may suffer less. Have a good sleep, have a peaceful dream. When you wake up tomorrow, be grateful that the fragile civilization has separated your life from theirs. The nightmare of medieval soldiers has come to an end. Our responsibility to draw essence from this has only just begun. Good night. May your rest be something they can never achieve.